Okay, we're finally here. We made it to number 1. So far, we learned that consistent marketing wins consistency credit that we can cash in as reliability. We also learned a nut kick gets the point across. Okay, yeah, we already knew that. On the Innovation Hour, Captain Obvious taught us what Flannery O'Connor used to say about good fiction, namely that gods are never subtle. Hit prospects over the head with your brand promise. Then hit them over and over again like we learned on the Tactical Marketing Call. At number 1, we return to the Personal Edge Call. In the past, Rich has dealt with goal setting, independent personal value, and defining your chief aim on this call. This month, he addresses true happiness. Not a small topic. And you may or may not be surprised that it's not a topic that focuses on one's business life. Instead, the path to true happiness is paved with true relationships. Last but not least,
number 1.
True happiness, what is it really? The CEO of Zappos is obsessed with the pursuit of happiness. And if you read his story, it's kind of an interesting one. And quite frankly, without knowing him or really even knowing all that much about him, I'm a little bit concerned for this guy. He's a guy who I think is in his mid to late 30s. He runs his company, Zappos. It's been phenomenally successful. He's personally a millionaire many, many times over. Yet he is perpetually searching for happiness. And if you're on his tweets, that's how I know about him, is I receive his tweets. And all of his tweets are quotes and sayings and things relating to how do you become happy. Now, I've read a little bit about him. There's some articles in Inc. magazine, a couple other things I've read about him. And he's kind of a quirky guy. And none of this is about, hey, this guy's doing things wrong, or, oh, watch out, this guy's going to fail. It really doesn't have to do with that. But his situation has caused me to pause and think for a moment, because here's what we have with this guy from Zappos. He's a guy that has all the money in the world, yet apparently it seems that he has no real life outside of Zappos. He's not married. He has no kids. He has no, what I would perceive, and again, I'm admitting I don't know this for sure, but he has what I would perceive to be no true relationships outside of his business. And he has philosophies of business. He's famous for taking employees and vendors out for wild nights of binge drinking. And he lives kind of this party life, and yet he's always searching for happiness. Here's all I'm trying to say with this. This isn't really a lecture about the guy from Zappos, just using him as a placeholder example. As we look at what is truly going to make us happy, I think it has a lot to do with understanding and appreciating the growth that we have as individuals, like I've talked about already. But also, it has very little to do with possessions. It has very little to do with whatever our self-indulgences are. And I think that in absence of true happiness, we try to compensate by either indulging in things, whether it be a partying lifestyle or some kind of illicit behavior perhaps, or we try to gather up possessions because they give us worth, they give us self-meaning, they give us some kind of sense of accomplishment. But the reality, here's what I found. This is just my personal 2 cents, and you can take it and smoke it in your pipe, do whatever you want with it. My 2 cents is, this is what I've learned over the last 10 years, that the true happiness comes from the relationships that you have the ability to foster, whether that's with your family, your kids, spouse, perhaps it's with others that are outside of your immediate family. It could have something to do with relationships that are built as you endeavor to work towards some kind of greater good type of goal. I'm on record of having talked in detail about the Susan G. Komen Breast Cancer Foundation and some of those types of things. So it could be any number of relationships, with, again, any number meaning inside your family, outside of your family. But I would encourage you to take a close look at your attitude towards possessions, your attitude toward wealth, your attitude towards time spent in pursuit of these various things, whether it be self-indulgences, material possessions. And I'd like you to think about it and compare it to the time that you spend with pursuit of true relationships, meaningful endeavors, and take a look at that and compare. I remember one time Jim Rohn, the late, great Jim Rohn, he was talking about spending time, and he talked about the ratio of time spent for one activity versus another. And he said, look at your ratio of activity of worship versus your ratio of activity of watching sporting events. Now, those are two things, and you can choose any two things you want to put in those placeholders. But it really got me to thinking, how much time do I spend watching perhaps basketball game? Remember, I used the word earlier, self-indulgences. Doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with watching basketball games, but we've got to look at this, and we've got to weigh and measure the time that we spend, because it's heavy in certain areas that may not have any lasting impact on our lives or on other people's lives. So if you look at that example that Jim Rohn gave and say, okay, what kind of time am I spending in personal development or in worship at church, so to speak, versus how much am I spending, watching TV, playing video games? And you can substitute any worthwhile endeavor into column A, and you can substitute any potentially good but not ultimately the best type of activity into column B. And this goes into that whole concept of good, better, and best. Just because something is good doesn't mean it's better, it doesn't mean it's best. And this is especially true when it comes to determining how you're going to spend your time. So as you go into the next 10 years, just keep this in mind. Hopefully these have been some things that have helped you out. I remember listening to Jim Rohn. One other thing he taught me, and we'll end on this. This was a lecture that he gave back in the early 1980s. I believe it was right around 1980. So we're dating back 30 years now. And he was giving a speech to the executives of what was then known as Standard Oil. And they asked him in this lecture, they said, Jim Rohn, you're a man who travels the world, who has relationships all over the globe, who conducts business and has been successful, and you seem to have your finger on the pulse of the economy and on business and on people. So tell us, Jim Rohn, what do you think we can expect in the 1980s? And Jim Rohn looked at them and said, you're right. I do have connections all over the world, and I do have business success and relationships, and I've got a pretty good finger on the pulse of business and commerce and people, and I think I'm qualified to tell you what I think is going to happen during the next decade, called the 1980s. And they kind of did the E.F. Hutton thing where they put their ear up to hear what he had to say, and he said, I think that the next 10 years is going to be about like it's always been, which is, he went on to say, opportunity mixed with difficulty. And he told them that 6,000 years of recorded human history have shown us that we're always going to have opportunity mixed with difficulty.
6,000 years of consistent human history may sound stifling. However, in the things that matter, family, friends, personal happiness, we are better served by a steady course than an ever-changing one. Innovate your businesses, insiders. Don't reinvent the way the world goes around. Well, that's all we have time for today. I'm Stu Gray. This was the MYM Insider Monthly Top 10. Monthly means I'll talk to you soon. Until then, listen to the calls and call in. Maybe next month we'll be hearing you.